Hi everybody, Mai here. So last time I did a list of my top 10 favorite Disney films. So today we're gonna do the opposite. I'm going to talk about my least favorite films. Now keep in mind has nothing to do with third-party companies. Marvel movies are not included, as well as Pixar or Touchstone or Lucasfilms. This is just by Walt Disney Animation Pictures that had a theatrical release. So no sequels. That's a list for another day, promise me. Now it's very hard for Disney to fail because a lot of the time they do deliver with a really great product and a really great satisfying movie. These are just the ones that I find the weakest in my own biased personal opinion. It's gonna step in a lot of toes, and also I don't consider any of these movies bad except for the number one and number two. I think all of them can be enjoyed in some way. A lot of them are really greatly animated. These are just the ones that I personally don't like as much. So sit back and relax, and we will start the countdown. Number 10 is Atlantis, The Lost Empire. Now, on paper, this movie sounds great, very action-packed, magical, and it has a great supporting character cast. I think my main problem with this movie, as a person who loves characters and loves character development, is the main character and the villain. I think they're both extremely weak, and they make me not enjoy the movie as much. In the animation department, it is gorgeous. I love the music, and a lot of the CGI is really well used in this film. The problem really lies on Milo Touch, the main character, that despite the fact that he's voiced by Michael J. Fox, who's usually very likable, he just comes off as the boring nerd archetype, and he doesn't really go through the character development that I expected. He kind of just predictably goes from a nerd to a hero, and almost in a forced way. And also, I never found him very likable compared to the rest of the cast. Like, all the secondary characters are great, and they're very fun, and they have very colorful backstories, but it actually does a disservice to the movie because they upstage the main character and the villain. For example, the villain's sidekick Helga is way more interesting and way more compelling than Rourke, who's just a boring rich asshole who wants to get money, and that's like the most basic motivation for a villain. He is as basic as villains get. So that's what frustrates me about this movie, as well as Kirarakash, who's like this badass princess, but we don't see much of her, despite the fact that she's voiced by Cree Summer, whom I love. And it's just disappointing all throughout. I think this movie is just lost potential, that the right materials were there, the right design, the right action scenes. It's just the fact that the main character and the villain sucked, so that kind of dampens the whole experience to me. Also, this movie has a couple of plot holes that I find very distracting, especially when it comes to the Atlantean language. Apparently, the Atlantean language is the root of all languages. So when they speak to Kira, she can speak French, she can speak English. It just becomes very, very forced. And as well as the fact that this language has been lost to its people for so long after they sunk. I mean, wouldn't this advanced civilization have like a Rosetta Stone or something in hand, or a scribe of some sorts to teach them the language that they lost and the information they lost? It just has a lot of unanswered questions, as well as the movie has a steam-powered um, submarine, which, if you think about it, that would suffocate everybody. I know it looks really cool. I mean, it's awesome looking, but the fact that it's steam powered just makes me wonder what they were thinking. Number 9 is 101 Dalmatians, which is a very beloved movie by many, and I don't really blame it. My main problems with this movie is basically the history behind it. After Sleeping Beauty came out, the Walt Disney Studio was going through a lot of financial trouble, so to cut costs, they did something called a Xerox process, which basically turns animation sketches into cells instead of doing that hand inking process. It just makes everything look very unfinished, just very scratchy, and it was like the initial age of this Xerox era that I personally not a fond of. It doesn't look as polished as other Disney films. But that's not the main reason why I find this movie weak. I think the only thing I like about this movie is the villain, Cruella de Vil, who is extremely memorable, but the whole movie is pretty bland. It just relies on the cuteness of puppies for us to care. And I love dogs. I consider dogs to be one of my favorite animals, but it will take more than the cuteness of puppies to me actually caring about the situation. A lot of the characters seem very one note to me, and the ending to me always left a bad taste in my mouth, a very shitty moral in my opinion, because when I was a kid, whenever I watch 101 Dalmatians, I would always think that having a lot of dogs will just work out fine if you love them enough, but it actually does not consider the fact that you have to take care of animals individually and with a lot of patience, and the abundance of animals will just lead to disastrous results. Now, I wouldn't be saying this if after this movie was released, a lot of people adopted Dalmatians, and to their surprise, Dalmatians were not the most docile kind of dog breed, therefore there were a lot of Dalmatians abandoned. So all this stuff, the Xerox process, the abandoned Dalmatian puppies, the unmemorable story, it just gives me a bad taste in my mouth whenever I watch this movie. And I also think Lady and the Tramp was the stronger film about a dog's point of view, instead of this one, which just relies on the cuteness and the marketability of Dalmatian puppies. Number 8 is Bolt. Now this is in the same vein as 101 Dalmatians. I find that movie very forgettable and mostly relying on cuteness for us to care, but the other reason I don't like this movie as much is because the original idea for it was much stronger in my opinion. This movie was originally going to be directed by Chris Sanders, who is known as the director of Lilo and Stitch and the director of How to Train Your Dragon. If you see a lot of the concept art, Bolt was meant to be a little darker, a little edgier, and a little bit more fun, and the character designs looked more interesting than what they went with. Instead, they did a typical going home story, and they had Miley Cyrus voicing one of the characters, and they kind of made it more safe and family friendly. But in turn, they made it less memorable. I don't really see anybody saying, yeah, Bolt, that movie is my favorite Disney movie. It's genius. It's just this passerby movie that just came and went and didn't really leave much of an impact. The animation is pretty bland compared to what was being animated at that time, as well as the story seemed more like a Disney Channel special than anything. Now, there's nothing really that wrong with this movie, which is kind of its biggest downfall because there's nothing memorable about it. It's just cute animals doing cute animal things, and I guess the whole Bolt believing he's a real superhero shtick is pretty interesting, but that's like the only interesting factor of this movie, and again, nobody really actually remembers this movie very much for a reason. Unlike Meet the Robinsons, which is a flawed movie, but at least it tried so many things, like a futuristic setting and a villain that was more interesting and more three-dimensional. Here, they just like, fuck it, let's just make it as safe as it can be so the kiddies can buy any Bolt plushies and the girls can enjoy Miley Cyrus being in this. And that's pretty much it. Number 7 is Tangled. Where do I start with this one? Because this one I consider one of the most overrated Disney films ever. And it's mainly because it was a Disney princess film that was trying to be as safe as possible. It had the typical fairy tale setting, which was very generic. It had the typical Ariel protagonist, which we've seen many, many times, and whose love interest is basically Sinbad from DreamWorks. They were trying to do this DreamWorksy thing with the trailer and everything, trying to come off as like a roguish adventure between two people, but it turned out to be a typical Disney princess film. The whole dynamic between Mother Gothel and Rapunzel, a lot of people praise it. However, we've seen this dynamic done way better in Hunchback of Notre Dame with Frollo and Quasimodo. That whole thing was just handled in a much more interesting way in that. With Rapunzel being an artist and all that, I've seen that before in the Barbie Rapunzel movie. So the problem is, it's not the fact that it's not original, because no idea is 100% original. It's just that it didn't really offer anything new. The only thing that it really advanced in was the whole hair animation. The hair looks amazing. That hair is a character on its own, and it does look perfectly animated. For those who do not know, hair and water are extremely hard to animate, and there's a lot of water and there's a lot of hair in this movie. So it did advance in the animation department, and it did have a very good CGI fairy tale feeling instead of feeling very robotic and mostly like how early Pixar movies were, where they could only animate toys because they seemed plastic enough for the technology. Now everything looks like people, and like nature scenes look organic. Everything looks fine. I just think the story is very weak, and as a person who grew up with the Rapunzel story, there's so many ways you can make the story more interesting rather than just copying what DreamWorks did and just adding a few jokes and adding hair that can heal things, which is strange to say the least. I personally think this movie is loved more for its aesthetics rather than its story, because a lot of people just compliment how pretty the movie is and how funny Maximus is because he's a very well animated horse. But when it comes to the story and the actual character development, it is very blah. And this is just my opinion. You can like Tangled all you want, and I think it well deserves its fan base because it is a fun movie. It's just not my cup of tea. Number 6 is Pocahontas, the one film that ruined the Disney's renaissance, because ever since that movie came out, the declining quality was more noticeable as every movie came around. The problem with Pocahontas, it mostly lies in its concept. I think the concept of taking a historical story and adapting it in such a fairy tale-ish way is very misleading to the audience. When I was a kid, my mother told me that Pocahontas was a real person, so when I saw the Disney film, I was like, oh, this is exactly how it went about. And then I researched further, being curious about the story, and I realized that this woman had a terrible life and died of smallpox at the tender age of 20 something. And it just breaks my heart how you look up Pocahontas on Google and all you see is the Disney film and not the real person. And I think that's one of the major faults of the movie. They were so concerned with the history and the racial undertones and all of that that they forgot to make a good story. It turned out to be very boring and bland because they didn't want to offend anybody. And if you look into the production of this movie, a lot of the story writers were extremely concerned about people taking it in a politically incorrect way, that they took out a lot of the likability of the movie. They were so focused in making it realistic that the animals did not talk at all, despite the fact that the movie is about speaking to nature, so it makes sense that the animals can talk. So a lot of the comedy there is very mute and very underwhelming. And they were trying to make everything accurate with the clothing and everything like that, but the story itself is not accurate at all because Pocahontas and John Smith were never romantically involved in history. So it just became a very big mess. I also find the movie quite pretentious. It hammers you with its moral like an Uzi to the face. It's just be nice to nature, be nice to your enemy, be nice to everybody. So because the movie is so preachy about its moral, it becomes unlikable. And therefore, even if the movie was not based on history, it would still fall on its ass. Because during that time period in the 90s, there were so many movies about Save the Rainforest, like Fern Gully, and these preachy movies that just talked about their agenda and didn't talk about the story and the characters and the character development. It was just so preachy, and even though the animation is gorgeous, it's one of Disney's best 2D animation to date. And the songs as well. The songs are very memorable. I think it just is extremely boring and it falls flat on its story and characters ultimately.